One thing I've noticed as a Spanish learner is that many things that I hear in Spanish or that I read in Spanish, I don't understand. Even when I'm having conversations with my Spanish-speaking friends, I have noticed that I don't really speak the same way that they do. But I am fluent in Spanish and I can speak Spanish fluently, so what exactly is going on here? I've come to the realization that I don't have a good grasp on everyday Spanish, the natural way that natives speak Spanish amongst each other. So, how do we learn everyday Spanish? One really good way to learn everyday Spanish is to not focus so much on Spanish grammar. Now, there is nothing wrong with learning Spanish grammar, but some native Spanish speakers may not sound like a textbook, so they may not be speaking Spanish grammatically correct. This can cause a lot of confusion for us Spanish learners, especially if you are like me, because the foundation of the Spanish that I know came from school, and it was learning through the grammar rules and memorizing them. It's very confusing when you go through this comparison process. So you hear something that you don't understand, and then you're comparing what you just heard to the grammar that you have learned. And it's just not clicking in your head. Another thing that is going to help us learn everyday Spanish is to change the resources that we're using. Speaking of resources, if you didn't know, I just created my first ever product for Spanish learners, and it is called the Spanish Resource Kit. It has over 60 resources to learn Spanish, like podcasts and TV shows. If you want to know more about this kit, I have it linked down below in the description box. Now, when it comes to resources, maybe you have been watching a lot of YouTube channels and also listening to a lot of podcasts that were created by Spanish teachers. I think it's a good idea to reduce the amount of content and resources that you are consuming that come from Spanish teachers that were made for Spanish students, and start to consume more content and resources that come from native Spanish speakers that were created for native Spanish speakers. And yes, I do understand that this can vary because some Spanish teachers do teach everyday Spanish, but I think it's just a completely different experience when you're actually listening to more native content. And I think you can learn everyday Spanish a lot faster by consuming native content. I've been listening to music in Spanish. I listen to the Spanish radio when I'm driving. I watch a lot of YouTube channels that were created by native Spanish speakers that have a target audience of Spanish speakers. And I read books in Spanish. Funny enough, I used to think that I wouldn't be able to learn a lot of everyday Spanish from reading books in Spanish because, books are way too formal or the writing style is very formal, but I was very wrong. Honestly, it was kind of dumb that I actually came to that conclusion because I haven't read many books in Spanish, number one, and I've only been reading books in Spanish since 2020. Not only do I read books in Spanish to get exposure to everyday Spanish, but another thing that I love to do is go to the comment sections of YouTube videos, Instagram posts, Instagram reels, TikTok videos, so I can read the conversations that are happening there. Most of the time when I'm reading these comments, I am very confused. It may sound very weird, but I get really happy when I do get confused because, again, that just shows me how much everyday Spanish that I really don't know and how much I need to learn. Another good tip is to take notes. So you would write down all these words, these expressions, and these sentences that don't make any sense to you that you are seeing in the comment sections online or that you have heard in a podcast, or if you're watching a show on Netflix or something like that, and again, you are confused, just write those things down. And then we are going to try to figure out what they actually mean. The catch is here, it can be a long process of actually trying to understand a lot of everyday Spanish words and expressions. Because unfortunately, we can't always find the definitions and explanations of all these different types of words and expressions online, like on Reddit. However, the more that we consume native content consistently, everyday Spanish will make a lot more sense to us. Again, a lot of things that may be very confusing for us, we're not going to be able to find online, and definitely not in a grammar textbook. The Spanish language is very diverse, and for this reason, learning culture of Spanish-speaking countries can be very helpful as well to learn everyday Spanish, because different Spanish-speaking countries speak Spanish differently, if you haven't noticed yet. And the everyday Spanish that is used in Mexico could be quite different from the everyday Spanish that is used in the Dominican Republic or Peru. This is where having conversations in Spanish with native Spanish speakers comes into play. Like I mentioned mentioned at the beginning of this video, one way that I did learn that I wasn't speaking with everyday Spanish was when I was having conversations with my friends in Spanish. And not just with my Spanish speaking friends, but with many other native Spanish speakers that I've had conversations with. I always figure out that there's something that I do not understand. So that is one of the best things about having conversations with native Spanish speakers, is that you can actually ask them what they are saying. I've learned so many new words and expressions just by having conversations in Spanish and by listening very intently to these Spanish speakers. Actually, just a few days ago, one of my Spanish speaking friends sent me a reel from Instagram, and it was a short clip from a telenovela. And I honestly did not understand anything at all. But what he did was explain every single expression to me, and then after he answered all my questions, I finally understood that reel. Then I started to laugh because it was a joke. But when I first watched that reel, I didn't know it was a joke. The more that we start to learn everyday Spanish and learn how to use everyday Spanish, now we don't want to just keep it all in our minds, right? We don't just want to keep it on paper in our notebooks. But we now want to start to actually use everyday Spanish. So when we are speaking Spanish, either to ourselves at home or wherever we are, or when we are having conversations with native Spanish speakers, we want to start to include everyday Spanish into the way that we speak. At least for me, I still consider myself a baby when it comes to knowledge of the Spanish language and also speaking Spanish, because I've only been focusing on learning Spanish consistently and then also learning how to speak Spanish for about 4 years. So going through this process of consuming a lot of native content in Spanish to get exposure to everyday Spanish is extremely helpful. And then again, having conversations with native Spanish speakers so I can see how they have conversations naturally is incredibly useful for me. Now I just have to practice a lot more than I'm learning so I can actually improve the way that I'm speaking Spanish and sound a little bit more like a native Spanish speaker. If you liked this video and you thought it was helpful, make sure that you share it with one of your language learning friends. Hasta luego.